although that very same line of thought is something that I've always had a contention with, because even the people who do transition and go from one gender per se to another, really all they do is change aesthetically in order to fit the stereotypical expectation of that opposite gender. Or sometimes you have the non-binary, um, who essentially chase almost like an androgynous. Usually, if it's like a man transitioning into a non-binary person, they're going closer to the feminine, stereotypical expression of either lifestyle, behavior, and fashion. And with women going into the non-binary space, it's more of a melding into the more masculine tomboy look, which I don't think is necessarily. I mean, either way, you're just mixing stereotypes, and if you're calling the stereotypes oppressive, and then still trying to conform to them, how are those things? I just don't see how those two things can all be not only ideals, just depending on where you are, where you're coming from, and at the same time oppressive categories. Like I feel like that's kind of like an oxymoron almost. Like,
Well, that's interesting to me. And now I play devil's advocate. A lot of times I don't sincerely believe the views I try to steal, man. And I try to make it clear when I'm doing that. But right now I'm actually sincerely exploring because I actually don't know where I stand on this. So it's an interesting question, and I'm about to get philosophical, so hold your seatbelts. But like, hold on to your britches. But like, I feel like it's an interesting question. To what extent trans and non-binary people are intentionally mixing stereotypes per se, versus they're just expressing themselves the way they feel naturally, and we or other people who are observing this behavior or the observable correlates of various different behaviors are interpreting what they're doing that way. In other words, are you looking at trends based on whatever your limited observations are of trans and non-binary people, and are you saying that, oh, what you're essentially doing is mixing stereotypes because that's how you're interpreting what they're doing, versus are they actually seeking to do that? That's an interesting question. And it may be a question that at first strikes you as trivial or like not all that interesting, but it's interesting to me because it's getting at a blurred line between interpretations of people's behavior versus what their actual intent for their behavior is. And those aren't the same thing. And so I think that makes it hard to tell. There's some ambiguity at the very least there in terms of what people are actually intending to do versus how we're interpreting them. And we may be misunderstanding what they're doing. There's a
well,
potential there for that.
but the whole issue with dysphoria is that you believe that you are a certain way that is not confirmed by your biological reality.
Gender
I
dysphoria,
actually
I
have to
wanted to
go.
define it from the DSM-5. A concept designated in the DSM-5 as clinically significant distress or impairment related to gender incongruence, which may include desire to change primary and or secondary sex characteristics. Not all transgender or gender diverse people experience gender
Reality,
dysphoria.
if I'm getting that correct. Now, I can't tell you what it's like to feel like a woman, because I don't think that's something someone could tangibly say, that they can say like, hey, I know what it feels like to be like a woman, because it's like, or at least to be a female. um this is not something that I can possibly experience per se, because it just comes along with so many other biological realities that I've never experienced. I can say, for example, that I feel like I would want to be treated as a woman. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I think that's where the distinction with dysphoria, as far as the definition, um, is much more accurately portrayed. It's like you feel like you should be viewed and treated as a woman, as opposed to I I literally have a feeling, which is not necessarily the same thing as having as being a woman, for example. You can convince yourself of whatever, and it's affirmed only by what other people think of you and how you may look like that person. You know, i.e., the gender reassignment surgeries, the fashion that
That's
confirms.
part of it, but that's not. Is that the only part of it? So now I'm actually pushing back in a sincere way because I have some
But
genuine pushback against what you just said.
but the aesthetic change and the perception by other people are the two things that we're getting at when we're talking about gender affirmation.
But I don't think we're only getting at those. I'm also thinking. I think that a big part of gender dysphoria is our conceptions of ourselves. So that's the subjective part. What
But
you feel
that's what those
you
two
are.
things address. It's like you
No, but
what
there's a
you feel you are.
psychology. Yeah, they interact. I grant that. But what I'm saying is it's still separable from the other two. That's what
No,
I'm
I
saying.
understand. I'm saying the purpose of those things is to alleviate this disjunction between how you feel and what your biological reality is, and to remedy it. And this is their, I don't know of any other treatment that they're talking about other than the change in fashion and aesthetic and the way other people treat you. These are the only two things that I've heard ever to be used as treatment for that psychological disjunction. You understand what I'm
But
saying?
those would be but those would be the social or politically relevant correlates to an acknowledgement of who you are, though.
But do I
And
need
so
to
that's
acknowledge
why.
that you have dreads for you to have dreads? It's like there are
No,
certain things
you
about
don't need
you.
to acknowledge that I have dreads for me to have dreads.
So then,
But
if you are a
like you need
woman,
to
prove you
acknowledge, for
are.
example, that well, what I'm saying, so a better example that's more analogous might be it's gonna turn on race, and I can go to a
Hmm.
gender one if you want, but like acknowledging that I, as a person, a black man with dreads, am not inherently prone towards criminality in virtue of my aesthetic, because that is an aesthetic that has been associated with a disposition, a certain kind of disposition towards criminality or a disposition towards violence, and so acknowledging that that may not be true of me and treating me as like as a person and taking me on a case by case basis might be something that I would say relative to my racial identity is something that would affirm me as a human being, as an individual. I'm not like all these other people that look like me.
Sure, but like to stay on the same strain as far as like assumptions about like what's it called? Um, the prevalence of like violence within a certain gender or the other. Like that is something you can actually assume between men and women. Like the presence of testosterone in your body as a fact, it makes you more prone to violence. It makes you more prone to committing crimes. Like that's something that I could actually say for a fact. We know
The,
that.
the
Like
presence. So the relationship between testosterone and aggressive behavior has been well documented. But to go as far as to say that because I am male and because I have testosterone in my body, that makes me more prone towards violence is controversial as fuck.
I I
Because
don't
what it implies is that in some sense, I'm more likely to hurt people just because I'm a male. And
yeah,
that
that
engenders a kind of sexism that I think we don't want.
no,
Because there's
but you
plenty of
hold on.
hold on. First of all, there's a lot of diversity in the aggressive patterns of the behavior, the aggressive behavioral patterns of males.
Hmm.
Period.
That's
So there are a lot of males that have a lot of testosterone in their body who don't do shit to people, bro. And so, like the claim that you just made makes it seem as though like there's a reading of the claim that you just made that could be used to justify always operating under a sense of like having your guard up with respect to men because men have testosterone. And I think that that's inherently problematic. And that would be the most analogous kind of problematic reading of a claim like that. That would be analogous to the kinds of things that we have a problem about in like when we talk about race and race discussions, like the fact that there's statistically black people disproportionately commit a bunch of violent crimes. If you read into that statistical fact and then see a black person randomly on the street that looks like me, and then think as a police officer who has the ability to shoot me if you feel I'm a threat, that I'm a threat because statistically people who look like me are more likely to be a threat, and then you shoot me for no good reason, that's a problem, is it not?
I think there are a few other like decision making processes that go between that assumption and that actual result. I think
There better be,
there
because
are
it's
way more.
problematic as
Yeah,
fucking not.
but I think in this example, it kind of cuts out all of it and makes it seem like that people actually make decisions solely based on that one assumption, and I don't think that's true. I think that's one data point that goes into a myriad of other decision making processes that one person would make. And what's it called? As far as the expected behavior of someone, even if they are not presenting as a man, they are statistically more likely to be violent than someone who is biologically a woman. Like that's something that, and you pointed out correctly. There are differences between men themselves, but the gap between men and women is gigantic.
But if you are one
And
of the
especially when
people,
we're but especially if we're looking at people who are committing crimes and who are being either arrested for violence, fighting, whatever it may be,
I
or even
understand.
if you look at schools, I'm
I
sure you've
understand.
seen this. Like what percentage of girls get into fights versus what percentage of boys get into fights?
Yeah, I understand. I'm not denying the statistical data. What I'm saying is problematic about it is for the people who
Mm-hmm.
do not meet the expectations that citing those statistical trends produces.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You always have an opportunity for a person to be misidentified or misguidedly presumed to fit a pattern that is a general pattern but not a universal one. And every time that happens, it introduces the problematic nature of bias with respect to people who fit those identity categories, right? This applies with respect to most identity categories, including but not limited to gender identity categories. Okay. So you have a segment of the population, however statistically rare they may be, of trans and non-binary people, that's what we call them colloquially, for whom they do not fit certain kinds of gender norms or presuppositions. And like it's problematic in analogous ways to to expect people with certain kinds of biological realities to act and behave in certain ways that that for at least a segment of our population that's not natural to them, and it's not obvious what exactly is the matter or what exactly is problematic about the ways that they are inclined towards behaving with respect to how they dress, with respect to how they present themselves, with respect to how they identify, indeed, with respect to even uh, their sexual proclivities. We had a huge preoccupation with the sexual proclivity piece, which undergirds the whole gay rights movement, and now some people feel that this is kind of a natural extension of the last dying vestige of particular kinds of prejudices regarding our social expectations around how men and women are supposed to behave. And a lot of those expectations are actually heavily influenced by thousands of years old religious traditions and precepts in the West. And a lot of people who no longer buy into those religious precepts don't buy into those expectations. So there's a lot to unpack here that's going below the surface that I'm trying to draw out explicitly in
I
order to get you to see the nature of the problematic nature from the point of view of people who have these views. Go ahead. I don't want to
Yeah,
over talk you.
I see what you're saying.